Trial and error. That is the best way I can explain the process of this painting that I'm currently working on right here. Yes, that's right. Trial and error. Yes, I have an understanding of perspective, particularly 2-point perspective in this case, but I just went ahead and jumped the gun and tried painting the photo the way I saw it. Hello and welcome. My name is Charlambos. I go by Bob, and I'm not your typical painter. And in today's video, I'm going to demonstrate how I did the tiles in this painting right here. As mentioned before, it was a process of trial and error, and I'll be honest, I regret I didn't spend a little more time on the underpainting, or for that matter, doing a drawing ahead of time. But drawing is not something I usually do at all before a painting, and in this scenario I did not even grid. But before we get started with this demonstration, let's take a look at the photo that I used right here. As you can see, the main subject of the painting is this moped right here. But in today's video, I'm going to demonstrate on how I did the brickwork. One thing I want to point out is the two trees in the painting. This one in the distance, and this one in front of the moped. Let's get a close-up of the bricks now. This is the brickwork on the ground. As you can see, there's a lot of clarity and detail up close. And the further into the distance, there'll be less. And this is definitely something I tried to capture in the painting. The bricks also get smaller as they approach the tree in the back, and that sense of scale is very important to show depth and distance. The bricks are also not even. Some of them protrude. For example, these right here, thanks to the roots of the tree. And these kinds of imperfections are stuff that I tried to capture for a better sense of realism. And also the pattern. They have a specific pattern that's not traditional. They're not checkered. Instead, they're a little more intricate. Even though I don't use 2-point perspective, it's good to have an understanding of it. I'll be honest, this is not the video I'm going to go into detail on how to use 2-point perspective, but I will demonstrate real quickly how to keep it in mind as you do paintings. It is all about the vanishing points and knowing where they are. For example, let's look at the photo again carefully. As you can see, the lines of these tiles go towards that, and eventually they meet. That is why, towards the tree, these pieces of wood get more narrow. That also includes all the other lines here. For example, think of it like this. Unfortunately, I can't show you where the vanishing point is, but it's further down that way. Same thing can be said about the other direction. For example, the lines of the bricks, they eventually meet at a certain point, which is towards that way, which is not visible in the picture. Again, as mentioned, it's good to have an understanding of perspective when you are copying the photo. And it's very important because it will help establish a sense of depth and distance, of course. And going back to trial and error, there is the texture, and that required a lot of trial and error to get it right, and lots of layers as well. You'll see in the demonstration. Anyhow, enough talking. Let's get to the demonstration, shall we? After laying out the underpainting, I used the line work that I have established to start applying bodies of color, but during this time, I'm constantly correcting the perspective of the lines. This is something I will do throughout the video, which is to correct the lines and tiles in order to better match the photo. Anyhow, as for the color, if you look very carefully at the photo, you will notice there are 3 distinct colors for the ground, 2 gray tones and one that is almost white. That is at least a simple way to describe the colors. Now it is time to build the texture for the bigger tiles. One thing you will notice, the grays are not just grays. They will be composed of different variations of lights and darks, as well as some highlights that mimic the sunlight. It's important to note, these rocks that they used for the ground are actually different from the ones that are underneath the moped. They are a slightly different color, and they feature also a different type of texture. For the most part, I have to use line work that is horizontal. That's why I use different tones of lights and darks of the gray, but I do not apply them straight, more so in a wavy type of way. After applying the lines, I use a dry brush to soften the texture I just built, all for the purpose of laying out more lines on top. As I dry brush, I do so in the direction I laid out the lines, which is left and right in a way, not against. You will notice that I do this repetitively, where I build texture, dry brush, and then build more texture on top. It is partially trial and error, but I do pay attention to the photo, for one, to try to mimic the texture accordingly, and also to try to match the colors as best as I can. Now time for the most challenging part so far of the painting, and I will not lie, I had to redo this section multiple times in order to correct the perspective, the overall pattern of the tiles, and lastly the scale. Pretty much make sure that the tiles in the front are bigger and the ones in the distance get gradually smaller. But to start this process, I figured it would be a great idea to start painting the lines for the tiles first, and then worry about the texture afterwards. I figured that it was more important to make sure that the perspective of the tiles was as accurate as possible. The tiles didn't have a traditional pattern as well, so that made my job even harder, especially later when I tried to correct everything. And you will notice again throughout this video, I am constantly correcting the line work, because if the perspective is off, the rest of your painting will look off. To get a feel for the pattern, I began to work on the tiles that are very close to the viewer. I made the lines that divide the tiles very thick, but that's okay. I am going to correct as I go. One thing I do is paint the center of each tile, pushing the paint and eliminating the thickness of each line. During this time, I'm actually being mindful that eventually the tiles in the distance are going to have to match the ones in the front. That is why I'm painting lines that go all the way to the other tree. Once again, this is definitely a constant form of correction. When painting a pattern, it can be a challenge when you're trying to accurately depict the photo. But unless you did a heavy grid or a projection, matching the photo 100% is quite difficult. So at one point, you just have to make a compromise. For example, in my initial depiction, I made the tiles too big. That is why I start correcting them by making the ones in the front thinner. During this time, I'm redrawing the lines as well. And I'm also trying to make sure that the tiles line up for the most part from tree to tree. I do this by painting the lines from one end to the other, and then slowly adjusting the tiles that are up front. Besides just painting lines from tree to tree to make sure the tiles match, I'm also constantly repainting the lines from left to right to make sure the tiles line up in that direction as well. It might not look like it, but I am factoring perspective, particularly 2-point perspective. At the same time, I'm factoring the reference photo and also human imperfection. Some of the tiles are not flat on the ground, and later you will see that the ones in the very distance are elevated a bit because of the tree. As for the idea of constantly correcting as you're painting, now you can see in this section, I blurred out the line work I created earlier. I was not satisfied with the pattern the tiles were taking, but because I blurred the area with a dry brush versus completely erasing it, I have in a way a ghost image of the errors I created earlier. So in a way, I start repainting the lines of each tile again. I'm using 2 different colors, a dark tone for the horizontal lines and a very light tone for the ones that are vertical, particularly on the left side of each tile. The idea behind it is that the sun is hitting it from that angle. This time, while I'm recreating the pattern, I have a better idea on how to set each brick in a way to better match the floor pattern in the photo. As I'm adjusting the lines for the tiles, I'm painting them in the center as well, in a way to set in stone the position of the tiles, but also to eliminate the older lines. That way I'm not as confused as I continue to paint the brickwork on the ground. At some point it gets kind of tedious, but I found it necessary. Also, a very important tip. When painting something up close for a long period of time, it is a good idea to take a break and step back and see what you have done from a distance. That way you look at your painting as a whole and not just one section. For me, the most important thing to capture correctly, not just the perspective, but a sense of scale. You will notice at some point, I was not actually happy with the size of the bricks going from the front to the back. I kept looking at the photo and noticed that they appeared a lot smaller in it versus the ones I created in the painting. Like I mentioned before, I am constantly correcting things in this painting. Now time to work on the brickwork more in the distance. Like before, I am painting lines that will act as guides, but also in a way, I'm taking in consideration perspective. After lots of trial and error from doing the bricks earlier, I figured that lines as a guide will be helpful establishing the brick pattern. So instead of just focusing on laying the bricks correctly, I painted in a way a grid. And then afterwards, I started to paint the tiles on the ground. Oh, and did I mention I am constantly correcting things? Sadly for me, I realized towards the end that the tiles that I was painting were not getting smaller and smaller enough towards the back. So you will see at one point I repaint them again. As I mentioned, I am constantly correcting things. Not only do the tiles get smaller in the distance, the lines that divide the tiles also get thinner. Unfortunately for me, I didn't realize this until afterwards. As I started to paint the center of each brick on the ground, I began to thin out the lines, but as a result, the bricks were getting bigger, and that was thrown off my entire painting. After getting frustrated quite a bit, I decided to dry brush the area, in a way creating some ground texture, but most importantly, erasing the scale and perspective errors that I made, but at the same time leaving a ghost image, so later I could build on top of it. So with that said, let's get back to the bigger tiles on the left. Not sure if this is a tip, but I will mention it anyway. When you are getting frustrated with one section, it might be a good idea to move to another, and that is exactly what I did. Anyhow, the brickwork here is a lot more simpler, but there was definitely texture that I still needed to depict. Not just the tiles, but also the grout as well. Yes, the grout has texture, and it is different from the tiles. But the first step was to paint the line work that represented the grout. While doing this, I'm correcting the perspective too, and reshaping some of the bricks. As for trial and error, I went through several different brushes, but the ones that seemed to work the best were the frayed ones, especially for establishing some of the texture on the grout. They helped me lay out patterns of dots. I used both light and dark tones to establish the pattern, overlaying on top of each other, and of course, when necessary, dry brush the texture I establish, and repeat another layer of pattern on top until it looks just right. I do definitely use a finer brush later for more precise detail, but nothing like a frayed brush with hairs all over the place to help you establish a random pattern of dots. Now back to the tiles. Something important about them is that they protrude from the ground a bit, and because of that, there are highlights on the edges, particularly the parts that are in direct sunlight. And because of the sunlight, the tiles also cast small shadows on the grout. These highlights and shadows help give the illusion that they protrude from the ground a bit. Besides focusing on the division between the grout and the tiles, I continue also to build the texture. Like earlier in the video, I build layers of lines of different colors. And of course I would dry brush here and there too, and apply more lines if necessary. But I'm also paying attention to the photo for some key details, such as highlights on the sections of the tiles that stick out a bit, a few cracks here and there, and I try to make sure that the texture appears more sharp in the front and a bit dull in the back. That way I can create the illusion of depth and distance. Another important thing to note is that the long white rectangle that's between the two sets of tiles also has some texture, and I believe it's actually two pieces and not one. Anyhow, as for the texture, it is just a bunch of straight lines. I just made sure they were more visible up close and just created the impression of texture in the distance. Anyways, I continued to work on the tiles. Now that I'm confident that the perspective and pattern of the tiles are more accurate to the photo, I start to apply more detail, continuing to build the texture and also the highlights and shadows. But there are some notable shadows that I have not established yet. They are the tree, a pole, and of course the moped. Don't worry, I will cover the shadows later. Let's just say that they were pretty frustrating to paint as well. But for now, let me show you how I finished the big tiles in the front. As I continue to build the texture, now one of the focuses I have is trying to match the color in the photo. And instead of quickly building the lines that would represent the striations on the rock, I'm carefully painting them. I'm also paying attention to some of the imperfections. There's actually a crushed can in the photo. I haven't decided yet whether to include it. Should I? Let me know in the comments. And as I continue to build the texture, I'm constantly dry brushing. The key to mimicking a texture, such as these tiles on the ground, is to constantly build layer after layer. And that involves sometimes dry brushing in between each layer. But towards the end, you have to take it a bit slow and definitely take a very good look at the texture you're trying to mimic and try to capture very key distinctive details. This, in the end, will add to the overall realism. Now let's get back to the tiles that have that pattern. It is important to note that some time has passed by now and the paint is actually kind of dry. This also gives me the opportunity to correct the scaling of the bricks. I kept looking at the photo and I felt they were not small enough towards the back. nor were they getting gradually smaller. So the first step I do is paint lines, more like indicators, to determine how thin the tiles should be. Since what I have done previously is still visible, it is actually making it easier to correct my mistakes. I'm practically following the lines, but making sure this time that the tiles are thinner, and also getting smaller as they get closer to the tree in the back. And by now, since I had to redo the tiles a bunch of times, I got a lot of practice on how to handle the pattern. But the tiles in the back are lifted a bit. That is probably because of the roots of the tree. Even the metal grate that surrounds the tree is also lifted. I'll be honest, the tiles do not match the photo, especially since I was following the pattern, and by the time I reached the tree, I had to paint a different set of bricks that were lifted. I suppose that's the compromise I mentioned earlier, of trying to match the pattern as well as the photo. It is hard to get things 100% accurate, so you compromise. Now time to go back to the tiles in the front. Like the bigger ones in the left, my focus now is to finalize them by not only adding texture, but also trying to match the color closer to the photo. That is why I am applying some specks of titanium white mixed with cadmium yellow. Instead of the yellow, I'm also using cadmium orange in some sections, a very tad bit of it mixed with titanium white. Now it is time to paint the shadow of the moped. I have to admit, this section got tricky for me, all thanks to the pattern of the tiles, as well as the texture too. To get it right, I had to constantly redo the tiles. I applied dark tones for the most part, especially close to the rear tire, but there is also some cool light blues too, as well as some darker oranges. But my first goal was to map out where the shadow would be exactly. And because my tiles do not match the photo, I had to improvise the shadow. Because of the angle of the light, the shadow got thicker closer to the tree. Plus, the kickstand and the handlebars were also visible, but because of the direction of the sunlight, they were closer to the tree. The shadow was also a constant form of correction, and I had to rework the kickstand too. I pretty much applied light and dark tones to reshape the shadow here and there. Once I was satisfied with the shape of the shadow, I started to work on the texture again, as well as the line work for the tiles. But one of the most important things I did is I gently dry brushed the part of the shadow that was close to the front wheel. Why? Well, it all had to do with the direction of the sunlight. The shadow is very sharp near the rear wheel, and it becomes softer towards the front. And since the shadow was on multiple tiles, I had to carefully dry brush so I do not ruin too much progress. But I definitely kept the part of the shadow that is near the rear wheel very sharp and very dark. And besides the shadow of the moped, there were also shadows casted by a pole and a tree. And these shadows were actually different colors. The one that's behind the moped is from the pole, and that shadow is more of a neutral gray with an orange tone. Now it is time to detail the tiles that are up close. If you're trying to establish a sense of depth and distance, detailing things up close helps create that illusion, especially when things in the distance are more blurry and lack detail. First off, you want to make sure the texture is more pronounced. In other words, much sharper. I'm not just going to increase the detail in the texture. There are also some key imperfections that I want to capture. For example, some of the bricks are more lifted from the ground than others. And though there's no grout between these tiles, they have a distinct shape. For example, they are kind of like trapezoids on the top, and not what you consider a pure four-sided rectangle. I'm definitely not going to paint the shape of each brick one by one, at least not all of them. Instead, I will focus on the ones that are very close to the viewer. You will notice towards the end how much detail is visible on the tiles in the front versus the ones that are in the back. As mentioned before, creating the brickwork on the ground can be very repetitive and tedious, but towards the end, I try to be less random with my brushwork, especially when you're trying to wrap up a section. In a way, each brush stroke needs to have meaning. So, as I paint the tiles on the ground, I keep in mind a few key things. 1. The overall shape of each tile and the way they respond to the sunlight, such as the highlights on the edges, as well as also the texture. Some tiles also have different colors. With that said, variation is the key. That includes also the spacing between each tile and how some are more elevated than others. The brickwork is not perfect after all. And lastly, there was a certain detail I was holding off on, and that is some moss that has grown between the bricks. Now time to wrap up this demonstration. Towards the end, I work my way towards the back where the other tree is, refining each tile one by one in some cases, adding a few highlights here and there, creating different variations of tones for some of the bricks, all while constantly stepping back to make sure I minimize some of the detail. I do want the tiles in the back to recede after all, and of course I encountered a few challenges here and there too, such as painting between the wheels, and then there were those lifted bricks in the back, all courtesy of the roots of the tree. Definitely a lot of work went into this section, and to think I still have a building in the back to paint, some trees in the distance, and a storefront that has a giant glass window that in a way reflects the scenery, and it will be like painting another landscape that happens to be inside a landscape. Am I forgetting anything? Oh yeah, there's a moped in the painting. If you made it to the end, thanks for watching. I truly appreciate it, and I hope you found this video helpful also. If anything, the most helpful thing might be, it is to better prepare when doing a complicated painting, or section that is. That is probably my biggest regret, that I didn't spend more time on the underpainting. But maybe that's the biggest lesson of all. Learning from your mistakes, of course. Anyhow, for more of my work, check out my Instagram, not your typical painter of course, or my Etsy shop that is. Links are in the description. Anyhow, I'm not done with this painting. There's definitely a lot more to be done. But stick around. Eventually I will have a full video from beginning to end on how I completed it. This area right here is already a challenge, thanks to all the reflection. Until next time, bye for now.